The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the ICME Safety Centre members webinar focused on process safety culture today. Today, March 23rd, marks the 10th anniversary of the BP Texas City incident in which 15 people lost their lives and a further 180 people were injured. My name is Trish Kerrin and I'm the Director of the ICME Safety Centre. I joined ICME to lead the development of the ICME Safety Centre in January 2014. Prior to that, I had a career working in engineering, operations and process safety in the oil and gas and chemical industries. I'm joined today by Dr Paul V Tebo. Since retiring from DuPont in 2004, Dr Tebo has been helping companies build business value through sustainable growth and understand how to achieve world-class safety. His knowledge and expertise are built on making it happen in a large global company. At DuPont, Dr Tebo was Vice President, Safety, Health, Environment. His 35-year career spanned professional and management roles in research, engineering, strategic planning, as head of $2 billion global business units. Dr Tebo had global responsibility for integrated safety, health, environment excellence as a core business strategy, and for positioning and representing DuPont externally. He created and installed DuPont's The Goal is Zero approach to environmental stewardship and helped DuPont commit to a sustainable growth, including ambitious renewable energy and resource targets for 2010. He also created and managed DuPont's external biotechnology advisory panel. He served as the board chair of the Keystone Center, on the board of Stroudwater Research Center, and on the Chemical Engineering Advisory Council at several universities in the US. In 2005, he served as a member of the BP US Refineries Independent Safety Review Panel, chaired by former US Secretary of State James Baker. Today we will review the BP Texas City Refinery incident as a case study on process safety culture. As we progress through the webinar, you'll be able to ask questions or make comments by typing in the questions box on your screen. We will endeavour to answer your questions both during and at the conclusion of the presentation. On the 23rd of March 2005, an explosion and fire occurred at the BP Texas City Refinery. It resulted in 15 fatalities and 180 people being injured. The US Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, the CSB, commenced an investigation of the incident, which would last for approximately 2 years. This presentation will give a little bit of background on the incident itself, but it will mainly focus on the cultural and leadership root causes. There are many good sources of information on the technical details of the incident, such as the CSB report, which can be found at www.csb.gov. They also have a very good animation of the incident, which I would encourage you all to reflect over and view again. The photo above shows the remnants of the trailers where the 15 people perished and the proximity to the blowdown drum stack which the red arrow is pointing to. In the early hours of the 23rd of March 2005, the raffinate splitter tower in the isomerization unit was being restarted after a maintenance outage. The process to restart the unit required liquid hydrocarbon to be pumped through the tower. However, due to previous experience by the operators that the level could drop suddenly, instead of pumping the hydrocarbon through the tower, they closed the outlet line from the tower, allowing liquid to accumulate. The alarms and level indicators on the tower provided false information about the level of the liquid. Not only did the level indicator just measure the bottom of the tower, there were reports it was malfunctioning prior to startup. The tower eventually filled and liquid overflowed to the relief valve header. The pressure in this line increased to the point that the relief valves opened and relieved liquid to the blowdown drum. This then began to fill. It overflowed to an open sewer as well as releasing liquid via the stack. The liquid formed a vapour cloud in the area which found an ignition source. In the vicinity of the blowdown drum, there were some portable trailers being used to house contract workers during the maintenance works. There were 15 people in the trailers when the vapour cloud ignited. The trailers were flattened and the workers in them all perished in the incident. Built in 1934 by Amoco, the Texas City Refinery is one of the largest in the US. On December 31st, 1998, Amoco Corporation merged with BP, creating BP Amoco, and resulted in corporate functions moving to the BP London head office. When BP took over the refinery, they ordered a 25% reduction in the fixed costs. This was mandated across all refineries. The Texas City site, however, had a checkered past. Over a period of 30 years up to this incident, 23 people had died at the refinery. While their personal safety rates had improved, 3 people had died in the refinery in the 12 months prior to the incident. There was also evidence of a significant number of losses of containment. From 2002 to 2004, the losses of containment increased by 52% from 399 per year to 607 per year. The isomerization unit itself began production in 1985. Prior to this, some of the equipment had been used in a unit called an ultraformer. As such, some of the equipment dated back to the 1950s. The raffinate splitter section of the isomerization unit was installed in 1976. It was initially used for heavier fractions, and in 1985 was converted to handle lighter fractions. Its capacity was also increased over this period from 20,000 barrels per day to 33,000 barrels per day. In 2004, its operating pressure was down-rated from 75 psig to a relief pressure of 40 psig due to corrosion on the equipment. The isomerization blowdown drum and stack was initially installed in the mid-1950s, located in the southwest corner of the unit. In May 1957, it was moved to the extreme northwest corner to address a fire hazard which prevailed in certain weather conditions. Over many years, there were reviews done on the pressure handling system associated with the blowdown drum, but no changes were ever made to the design. In 1997, the blowdown drum and stack was replaced due to corrosion in a replacement in-kind project. This avoided the need to upgrade the system to a new accepted standard, such as a flare. However, the drum was actually smaller in diameter than the original, so it wasn't really a replacement in kind. As I mentioned earlier, this presentation will focus on the leadership and cultural learnings from this incident. The key lessons for leadership in organisations are listed here. You must be aware of the status of your safety systems and the outcomes. You cannot measure the presence of safety by tracking the absence of incidents or your lag indicators. You must focus on the right measures, and they need to help you predict issues. You must make sure you have sufficient resources to maintain a safe facility, both people and financial resources. Ageing facilities need sufficient attention and investment to maintain them, even in lean times such as we face today. You need to achieve and maintain an open culture. If you don't, people won't feel safe to report incidents and stop unsafe things from occurring. You need to make sure your people are out of potential consequence zones during higher risk activities. That is, you need to manage both sides of your bow tie. You need to ensure you have accurate procedures, they are being followed, and the equipment is correct for the process. You need to manage organisational change as well as equipment change. Some organisational changes can have significant impact on the safety of a facility, especially if these changes reduce experience and knowledge. You need to understand how much it costs to safely run a facility and what arbitrary cost reductions will do to your safety. Any cost reductions must be managed in a targeted way to ensure you are not creating an unintended safety issue. You need to understand how human factors impact your safety. Are you seeing incidents as a result of human error? If so, what human factors are creating that error? And you need to exercise your duty to provide leadership and governance on process safety. The startup procedure required pumping of the raffinate through the splitter tower. However, it was common practice to deviate from the procedure and block flow out of the tower. This was done to avoid losing liquid level during the startup, which may have damaged equipment downstream. Previous experience by the operators was that they could get sudden drops in the level of the tower. Compounding this issue was the acceptability to start the tower, even though there were reported malfunctions with the level gauges and pressure control valve on the tower. Another deviation from procedure was the lack of additional staff during the startup of the isomerization unit, as was required by BP's own safety guidelines. The tower overflowed into a blowdown drum rather than to a flare system. This was despite numerous recommendations to install a flare system. The blowdown drum was a deviation from current accepted engineering design and had resulted in numerous releases to atmosphere of flammable liquids in the past. Lastly, there was a history of releases of hydrocarbon to atmosphere. In the years prior to the incident, there had been 8 serious releases of hydrocarbon from the isomerization blowdown stack. This was an acceptable occurrence, a significant normalisation of deviance. For more information on normalisation of deviance, please take a look at the ISC webinar, which you'll find on our website, where we talked about the concept of normalisation of deviance using the case study of the Columbia Space Shuttle, but also then discussed a number of different traditional process safety incidents that occurred as a result of this phenomenon. Five months into the CSB investigation of the incident, they issued an urgent recommendation to examine the safety culture at BP's North American refineries. This independent panel became known as the Baker Panel. The Baker Panel was tasked with making a thorough, independent and credible assessment of the effectiveness of BP's corporate oversight of safety management systems at its 5 US refineries and its corporate safety culture. It had a remit to make recommendations to BP for improvement in these areas. The panel was made up of a number of experts across various fields and included retired Admiral Frank L. Bowman from the Nuclear Energy Institute, Glenn Irwin from the United Steel, Paper and Forestry, Rubber Manufacturing Energy, Allied Industrial and Service Workers International Union, Slade Gordon, a former senator and member of the 9/11 Commission, Dennis C. Hendershot, a staff consultant for the Centre for Chemical Process Safety, Nancy G. Levison, a professor of aeronautics and astronautics as well as engineering systems at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sharon Priest, a former Arkansas Secretary of State, Isidore Rosenthal, a former board member of the CSB and senior research fellow at the Wharton Risk Management and Decision Processes Centre, Douglas A. Wigman, the director of the Human Factors and Patient Safety Research Program at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, L. Dwayne Wilson, a former Vice President of Refining, Marketing, Supply and Transportation for Fuels Technology of ConocoPhillips, and last but not least, Dr Paul V Tebo, who joins us today. This panel was led by James A. Baker, the former US Secretary of State. So the panel focused on corporate safety culture, process safety management and performance evaluation as well as corporate oversight. It made 10 recommendations and BP agreed to implement all 10 of those following the report. Recommendation 1, Process Safety Leadership. The Board of Directors of BP, BP's executive management, including its Group Chief Executive, and other members of BP's corporate management must provide effective leadership on and establish appropriate goals for process safety. Those individuals must demonstrate their commitment to process safety by articulating a clear message on the importance of process safety and matching that message both with the policies they adopt and the actions they take. Recommendation 2, Integrated and Comprehensive Process Safety Management System. BP should establish and implement an integrated and comprehensive process safety management system that systematically and continuously identifies, reduces and manages process safety risks at its US refineries. From my reading, process safety seemed to be a blind spot for BP. It's likely that BP was not the only organisation that had that blind spot though. It's important to ensure process safety is elevated in an organisation and managed. This can be aided via an integrated management system that clearly includes process safety or by a standalone process safety management system. There's no right or wrong answer here, provided process safety is included in the management systems, is explicit and is managed at the highest levels of an organisation. Recommendation 3, Process Safety Knowledge and Expertise. BP should develop and implement a system to ensure that its executive management, its refining line management above the refinery level, and all US refining personnel, including managers, supervisors, workers and contractors, possess an appropriate level of process safety knowledge and expertise. Interestingly, the ISC members have also identified competency as an important issue. As a result of this, we have been working with the members to develop a comprehensive process safety competency matrix that covers an entire organisation, from frontline worker to director and chairman. This draft matrix is currently out for comment with a plan to publish in mid-2015. Recommendation 4, Process Safety Culture. BP should involve the relevant stakeholders to develop a positive, trusting and open process safety culture within each US refinery. In my personal experience, without a positive safety culture, people won't feel safe to raise safety concerns, report incidents or near misses, and they certainly won't have the confidence to intervene when safety is compromised. Dr. James Reason states that there are 5 elements to a good safety culture. Informed, where relevant data is collected, analysed and safety information is actively disseminated. Reporting, where reports are acted upon and people are confident that they can report without fear of retribution. Learning, the organisation learns from its mistakes and makes necessary changes. Just, errors will not be punished if unintentional, but willful, deliberate acts must have consequences. Flexible, people are able to adapt effectively to changing demands. Recommendation 5, clearly defined expectations and accountability for process safety. BP should clearly define expectations and strengthen accountability for process safety performance at all levels in executive management and in the refining, managerial and supervisory reporting line. Recommendation 6, support for line management. BP should provide more effective and better coordinated process safety support for the US refining line organisation. Recommendation 7, leading and lagging performance indicators for process safety. BP should develop, implement, maintain and periodically update an integrated set of leading and lagging performance indicators for more effectively monitoring the process safety of the US refineries by BP's refining line management, executive management including the Group Chief Executive, the Board of Directors. In addition, BP should work with the US Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board and with industry, labour organisations, other governmental agencies and other organisations to develop a consensus set of leading and lagging indicators for process safety performance for use in the refining and chemical processing industries. In my experience, while this consensus has been somewhat reached by the development of the American Petroleum Institute recommended Practice 754, it still largely focuses on lagging indicators and is very limited in scope to downstream petrochemical facilities as per that recommendation. The ISC has been working with our members to develop a suite of leading metrics which cover all the different sorts of industries. So we've spoken more broadly of mining sector, upstream oil and gas, downstream oil and gas, chemical manufacturing, so that we can get a broader suite of metrics. And these are currently out for comment with a plan to publish these metrics in mid-2015 and look at starting to report against those metrics in 2016. Recommendation 8, process safety auditing. BP should establish and implement an effective system to audit process safety performance at its US refineries. Recommendation 9, board monitoring. BP's board should monitor the implementation of the recommendations of the panel, including the related commentary, and the ongoing process safety performance of BP's US refineries. The board should, for a period of at least 5 calendar years, engage an independent monitor to report annually to the board on BP's progress in implementing the panel's recommendations. The board should also report publicly on the progress of such implementation and on BP's ongoing process safety performance. And lastly, recommendation 10, an industry leader. BP should use the lessons learned from the Texas City tragedy and from the panel's report to transform the company into a recognised industry leader in process safety management. I think one of the sad things I saw this morning is the CSB tweeted to say that since the BP Texas City refinery, 58 refinery workers have died in the last 10 years in US refineries, which is just an absolute tragedy. So we're still, across the board, not really effectively learning about process safety from these incidents that occur. I would now like to welcome Paul Tebo. Paul, can you start with a brief summary of the important learnings you took away from the study, particularly related to what you saw compared to the process safety culture and practices at DuPont, generally considered to be world-class?
Thank you, Trish. It's a pleasure to be on the webinar today and to share some of the key learnings I took away from the study. These are very supportive of the major findings that Trish has just presented, and hopefully they'll be additive. Since the panel had its findings, I've had a chance to talk to many companies about the findings, and what I'm going to do is give you a flavor of the type of information I convey. However, I would follow Trish's recommendation to take a look at the panel report itself, particularly the executive summary. And if you haven't seen the CSB video, it's very important to take a look at that. It's very clear. When you look at the video, you say to yourself, how could all of these things have gone wrong at once? The Texas City explosion was a tragedy in at least 3 dimensions. The one that's the most important, obviously, is that 15 lives were lost, and 170 people were injured. The first meeting I went to of the panel, it was just before Christmas, and the first speaker that came in was a woman, and she brought in a book of pictures, and she passed them around, and she said, these people's father and grandfather won't be home for Christmas this year or ever again. And it really touched our hearts, this personal tragedy side of the Texas City explosion. The second tragedy was financial. The refinery went through a very prolonged outage, and it's a very major refinery. Plus, they had the rebuild costs. And to BP's credit, they took their time to make sure that they started the refinery up safely. The third was a very personal tragedy in the legacy of the CEO. He had been described and regarded as the most well-respected and best businessman of the decade prior to this incident. And of course, his legacy has been rewritten considerably since the explosion. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about the panel's work. When I first got on the panel and met with BP, I formed 3 initial impressions, which when we got finished, I had confirmed. But the first 3 initial impressions were the underlying critical issue was leadership. Now, as I've worked with companies over the outside of DuPont over the last 10 years, I always look at leadership first. What is the composition of leadership? What's their background? What were they doing? What were they focused on when the explosion occurred? What types of things did they talk about most? And those types of things. The second was that safety was not a core value, even though we were told it was. I asked the question early on, is safety a core value? The senior BP person said yes. I then walked and visited all 5 North American refineries, and the conclusion was it was not. And I think most of you know how to tell a core value, but if you have a question in that area, let me know. Third, and Trish mentioned this, process safety was a blind spot. And I find this is true in many companies. A lot of companies say that they're well-versed in safety, but what they are really talking about is personal safety. And because process safety incidents tend to not occur very often, but when they do, they have high consequences, people are not as familiar with the subject. They certainly aren't as familiar with the metrics, and it's not a part of their life like personal safety is. Now, BP stated their intent is no accidents, no harm to people or to the environment. This was the understanding and expectations and accountability and actions. As I looked at leadership, they did not support that intent. Only one member of the senior leadership team had any operations experience. And in a conversation with John Brown, the CEO, he stated that the goal of zero was the right one, but that he just didn't believe it was possible. Now, from my experience, believing is the first step to achieving. As is the case in many companies, personal safety excellence was equated with process safety excellence. But this is not necessarily the case. BP's days away from work frequency on a million-hour work-hour basis had dropped from 7.5 in 1986 to 0.5 in 2005. And a frequency of 0.5 brings you into a world-class group. On the other hand, BP globally had suffered an average of 20 fatalities in their employee and contractor force every year between the years of 1999 and 2005. And since most of these occurred as single events until the Texas City explosion, they were just part of running the business. And so the message was the data that they were looking at, particularly the senior management, would lead them to believe that safety was improving. And the fact that they weren't really talking about the fatalities was more a factor that they were having them one at a time, not in a bunch. It's similar to car accidents versus a plane crash. You can have several car accidents and people don't pay attention to it, but you have one plane crash with fatalities and it's a big deal. Most of the data shown to us as a panel initially was related to personal safety. However, after asking for process safety data, we saw data that showed that at Texas City, loss of contained incidents had increased from 400 in 2002 to 500 in 2003 to 600 in 2004. Well, either BP did not understand the importance of these data, or they were not reporting them to management. Another set of data that was significant was number of overdue inspections. At Texas City, the number of overdue inspections in 2004 was 1,788, with many related to thickness measurement locations and pressure safety valves. We also found that, like many companies, many of the safety statistics were lagging indicators. After our study, BP added a series of leading indicators, such as number of overdue inspections and tests, and completion and closure of major accident risk assessments. This was a great step forward. One statistic that floored me was great days. On a visit to one of the sites, they talked about great days, which were days with zero injuries or accidents. They told me that their goal for the year was 85%. And the year we visited, they were at 86% and were running ahead of their goal. Now, for me, the only goal for great days must be 100%, 365 days a year. And this is particularly true for those that are committed to zero harm. The employees at the Texas City plant had a very can-do attitude. Do what it takes to get the job done. I think this is great as long as there is strong operating discipline. With a hugely complex refinery that also included a chemical plant, a site with over 3,000 employees and contractors, the rules must be followed. This was not the case on the day the explosion occurred, and was probably not the case for many days before. Where deviations are needed, the operators need to follow the rules for deviations. Ad hoc deviations cannot be normalized. It leads eventually to disaster. The site leader turnover had been significant at Texas City. It appeared to me that they were using the site manager slot for training. They also saw the role of the site manager as business unit leader, which meant the person had business responsibility. And again, from my experience, the primary role of the senior person on the site is to ensure that the site runs safely and productively. And for the site the size of Texas City, the tenure of the site manager needs to be measured in years, not months. Their auditing program was focused on compliance with the law versus on excellence. They suffered from initiative overload, a mandate to do driver training across the country when all of the BP's driving accidents were occurring in Ullman. Much of their training was computer-based versus in the field. And this greatly concerned the panel because it's very difficult to get a feel for process safety by sitting at a computer. And in many plants, including Texas City, the work environment was not one that would be described as positive, open, and trusting. This made the reporting of near misses and other bad news difficult. In addition, it was particularly difficult to get bad news from Texas to London and then up through the layers in London. Finally, as I observed the culture on many of the sites I visited, I could not feel or see a strong safety culture. The visibility of safety was low compared to climate change, an area where BP had forged a leading position, and versus the culture I had lived within DuPont. As we move to your questions, let me mention 4 pillars that DuPont uses to achieve a world-class safety culture and level of performance in both personal and process safety. First is strong safety culture built on felt leadership. And felt is not an acronym for 4 words. It's felt, visible, constant, and consistent in actions, a walk the talk, clear expectations that zero is both believable and achievable. Second, a strong operating discipline. Follow the rules culture must be set by leadership. Third, strong line of organization, accountability, and clear consequences for actions that hurt or can hurt someone or someone else. At one site, they told me they had an operator who was caught driving 100 kilometers an hour through the site. And I asked him, what'd you do to the operator? Expecting to hear that they'd fired him. Well, they hadn't. They had simply disciplined him and put him back to work. And fourth, many leading and lagging performance indicators that are reported and are acted upon. So this is a quick summary, and Trish and I now look forward to the questions that you might have.
Thanks for that, Paul. I think that was a really, really good summary, and I'd just like to pick up on one of those comments that you made at the very end there around the 4 pillars, around the strong operating discipline. And I think one of the things that we've probably failed to do as process safety professionals over the years is effectively communicate through to our management, our executive, our boards, that in fact good process safety is good business, because when you have good process safety you do have strong operating discipline and you do have productivity and reliability as well, because as you mentioned earlier, it's very expensive to damage a plant, it's very time consuming to bring it back up online, and all of that time you are just losing money. So I'd like to sorry Paul, go on.
I was just going to add, my experience with many companies is I never find that the procedures are the problem. What I do find is the following of the procedures is the problem. Mm-hmm. And in many cultures, slippage occurs slowly but consistently to a point where what you call normalization of deviance becomes a part of the culture. And if you listen to BP and you look at the video, you realize that the events that had happened on the day that the Texas City explosion occurred probably had happened many, many days before.
Yes. What I might do is, if anyone has any questions at all that they would like us to discuss with Paul, please type them into your questions box on your control panel, and I'll see those and raise those questions. In the meantime, though, Paul, in terms of when you did go into Texas City and you did look at the other former Amoco sites that then became BP Amoco, what did you learn about how facilities should be integrated following merger activities? Because we still see a lot of merger activities occur today, and the blending of two different cultures, two different standards can have some quite significant consequences on safety. Do you have any thoughts around how that could be done better?
Well, the input we got, interestingly, many people felt that BP actually was running the sites more safely than Amoco did. So that's one piece of data that we had. But my experience over time is that when you integrate two companies and many sites, you need to take a very, very strong approach to, I would call it safety, health, and environment. Get in early. In DuPont, when we would acquire a company or a series of sites, we would go in quickly and upfront with the safety, health, and environmental standards. We would put a DuPont site manager on the acquired site, and we would expect that site manager to be out in the field at least a third of the time, ensuring that safety was a top priority on the site.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really a matter of getting the standards in quickly and taking your best site managers and putting them on the sites and making sure they're out in the field observing safety.
Okay. We've got a question come in from one of our observers now. Was the culture in BP specific to refining or across the BP organisation? And then a reference here has been made to Macondo, and in fact that was actually a follow-up question I had as well. Around 5 years after this incident, BP suffered the Macondo blowout in the Gulf of Mexico as well. So, yeah, was it just a refining, or do you think it was more broad across BP from what you saw in your interviews with Lord Brown?
Well, our charter was the North American Refining Network, 5 sites. But during our study, there was an oil spill in Alaska, BP. And so the thought there is once it's in the culture, it's in the culture. 5 years later, you had the upstream part of the organization with what I call probably the worst environmental disaster I've ever seen in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you could say to yourself, it would have been good if the panel had recommended that the learnings from the downstream part of the organization were translated in a way for us to audit that they were translated throughout the rest of the company. So the symptoms would say that it was a much broader problem than simply the refinery network.
Right, and I think perhaps we saw that play out in Macondo itself with that incident that tragically lost 11 lives and spilled a substantial amount of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. In terms of, you mentioned personal safety a little bit earlier as well, and how their personal safety had been improving. Do you have any sort of tips around how you strike a balance between personal and process safety? Because it's a daily issue that all of us face in working in these different types of industries. How do we balance personal and process safety? They're both important.
Well, at DuPont, we treated them as two different subjects. Now, the culture that goes behind safety in general is similar. Things like openness and trust and reporting and things like that. But process safety, as you know, it tends to be a more technical subject. And the gap that's there is leadership believes that they know safety, period. And yet, when you talk to them, they almost always relate personal safety stories. I was at a company and we were talking about occupational health, and the vice president I was talking to said, well, you know, I've got a back problem. I know all about health. And in fact, he didn't know about it, but he thought he did.
Yep.
And so leadership gets lulled into believing that they understand the broad aspects of safety. DuPont, when we did an in-depth study of our safety culture, we did two. We did one on personal safety and occupational health, and then we did one specifically on process safety because we were worried that we missed a lot when we just looked at the personal safety side.
Okay. I've got another few questions come in here now. So, and this one ties in a little bit to that what we were just discussing with personal and process safety there. Did you review or observe any differences in terms of deviance to procedures for personal versus process safety? Will we seeing deviance across the board within the organisation?
It's interesting. The deviance we saw had to do between sites. They have 5 sites, a couple of them really big and the other 3 not as big. We went to one site where the site manager had been there in the job, I think it was 6 to 8 years, and had a great interest and knowledge in process safety. Well, guess what? They had no overdue audits. They had no incidents, loss of containment incidents. The site was just immaculate. Mm-hmm. And yet we'd go to another site where the site manager was turning over every 6 to 12 months, being used as a training spot. You'd go into a meeting and the site manager would welcome you to the site and turn the safety message, the opening safety message, over to the safety engineer.
Right.
And so the deviance we tended to see was site to site, not between necessarily personal safety but process safety. Having said that, they were doing many things that focused on improvement to personal safety. So there's a lot of credit to be given there. But to take that data and then say everything's okay in process safety was the real tragedy.
Okay. I've got a lot of questions coming in now, and interestingly, they're all coming in from Perth, and the Perth people are up very early in the morning to participate in this, so that's great to see. What would a robust budget and organisational structure management of change look like? That's an interesting question. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the first part's budget. I found almost in every company I've worked in, and it was true in DuPont, the budget is under pressure all the time. The challenge is to not consider safety or process safety as a staff responsibility, but to broaden the knowledge base and the leadership throughout the organization. People would ask me in DuPont, how many people in your organization? And I'd say if DuPont at the time had 60,000 people, it's 60,000 people. Clearly the site managers need to be in the lead. Their job needs to be not running the business, it needs to be running the site. They need to pay attention to process safety. Okay? And there needs to be in the organization a way to train people to get a feel for process safety, not to look at it on a computer.
Yep.
In DuPont we used a fire training school. Now, we didn't like to have explosions for people to get near to. But you'd say to yourself, you know, anybody that's been on a plant site knows what I'm talking about. There's a feel to how a plant runs.
Yep.
And once you're close to something that's a tragic event or a release or a fire, you learn to have a lot of respect for the subject and to pay attention to it. If you haven't, it's just an academic subject.
Yep.
So I would say the real key is to broadening the sphere of people involved and to look for ways to have good training that's got some element that has to do with the physical nature of process safety.
Okay. Do you think a focus on process safety rather than major accident prevention would have opened upstream organisations to review the management of their major accident events? So maybe that's a bit of a shift there.
I think efforts focused on risk assessment, accident prevention, whatever you want to call it. I like the concept of auditing a virtual audit ahead of time to identify the next place for a process incident and then correcting it. I like the concept of getting other sites, process safety experts, to come into my site to audit it because they bring in a fresh set of eyes and they take back the learnings from the site.
Okay.
So I think anything that gets you up front, I don't see how you can manage process safety from a lagging standpoint. And that's why the subject of leading indicators is so important.
Yeah. So another interesting question here. So BP have had several high-profile incidents, and if I just think back about some of them, you know, they even date back well into the 80s and 90s at the Grangemouth refinery before we then moved over onto continental USA, where we had Texas City, we had the Alaska pipeline, we had Deepwater Horizon. How do we convince people that these events are not just due to a bad organisation, but that they could happen anywhere?
Yeah, yeah. That's a great question. I don't know where it came from, but it's a great question. One of the things that's in my experience base is that industry in general tends to have a major explosion or event about every 5 years, and then people work really hard on the area for about 3, and then they tail off because nothing happens. And then boom, it happens again. And that's where your organization, Trish, comes in, and a lot of the places that are a center for excellence. There needs to be a way to continue to lift up the tragedies that are involved when you have an incident like this, particularly the personal side, and to keep the attention strong. Senior management likes to work on problems, and when you're working on a thing like the goal is 0 in DuPont, as you achieve 0, management starts to assume that you don't need a budget and you don't need to work on it. Well, that's wrong.
Yep.
So you need to have good ways to demonstrate how important not having an event is. You take a simple process event, and you need to lift up the potential for human tragedy and for business tragedy. We had about a 30, probably a 1-minute fire in a compressor in a major plant in Texas. This is DuPont. And it shut the plant down for 3 months. And it cost about $1 million to put the compressor back online. But the business was oversold and was out of business for 3 months. So what do? Well, you got to teach your competitors to supply your customers. And then when you start up, you don't get all your customers back.
Yep.
You get about 75% back. So the real key here is to keep it visible and to keep the potential, or what I would call the financial impact that could occur if something did happen.
Yeah, and that then we've got another question following on from that is, what are areas that need to be addressed in government policy and corporate governance as well? So, you know, how do we keep it in the boardroom, and how do we keep it on the radar of the regulators? I think in a number of countries there's a number of different ways that regulations are enforced with regard to process safety. I think one of the interesting reports I heard last year from OSHA at a conference was that if they were to visit every major 1910 regulated site, it would take them 103 years. Which obviously is an issue. What needs to happen here?
Well, I just kind of went through it. I think the business case has to be made within business. It's interesting, within BP, the refinery in California thought that regulations actually helped them in terms of process safety.
Okay.
From my experience, regulations take a long time. Like you say, it takes a long time to audit. The best thing that can happen is that senior leadership, particularly at the board level and the senior management level, have some basic understanding of process safety, have some leading and lagging indicators shown to them once a month, okay? And things like near misses are reported quickly to the senior people.
Yep.
I also like to have senior people, when they visit sites, go out and walk around the sites. Don't spend all their time sitting in a conference room.
Yep.
Go out and touch and feel the equipment. Go out on a night shift to see what it's like on a refinery at night. We had a current CEO of DuPont, when she was a business unit leader, go and do audits at plant sites. Terrific.
Yep.
It's a great way to build the respect and the knowledge base for process safety within the senior people. If you have to wait for the regulations to tell you, you may end up too late.
Yeah, we need to go well beyond this idea of it's just about achieving compliance. It's more than that. The last question we have coming through here is there an opportunity to demystify process safety in order to build a shared understanding across the organisation? And I guess I might just throw a little bit into this one before I hand over to you, Paul. One of the things we've been doing in the Safety Centre is looking at how we can define process safety in simpler terms without oversimplifying the fact, so we can have conversations. And so we've now started to talk about some functional areas within an organisation and focus on the leadership of those areas. So we talk about knowledge and competence, engineering and design, systems and procedures, assurance, human factors, and lastly culture, so that we can then look at how we can have those conversations rather than talking about complex risk calculations, which when we need people to make decisions, we tell them that the risk is 10 to the minus 4, so they need to do something about it. They don't really understand that. So we need to approach it differently and start to talk in some different terms. What are your thoughts on how we demystify process safety?
Well, I think what you're doing is terrific. And so let me just give you an additive thought. And it's based away from what I did around environment in DuPont, because one of the things we got working on was zero waste. Mm-hmm. And so rather than go to the leadership on this one, I went to the plant sites and got in the room with the operators, and we talked about it.
Yep.
And it's interesting. I think everybody on the call knows this, how much the operators know. And when I talked about things that were too technical, you could see the eyes glazed over. But if I could get it in their terms, or better way was to listen to them and to find out how they would describe it. I think getting this so it's not a subject that people fear in the sense of being a technical subject. You know, this has to things with things getting spilled out of vessels, has to do with things getting released from pipes.
Yep.
It has to do with ignition sources.
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with all these things that the operators know. If people had asked the Texas City operators to sit in a room and talk about, you know, what potentially could go wrong or what was really not operating properly the day it happened,
yep,
we'd get it explained in language that's clear. So I really support the thought that this needs to be demystified. Having some metrics that are very simple would also be very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got just one last question that's come in now, and it's actually a little bit of a technical one. The report didn't talk to using a level transmitter rather than a level switch on a cold vent stack. This device is inherently more reliable and has a lower dangerous failure rate, and yes, that is true. Is it true the device was routinely tested but failed and no one put any importance on this? When you read through the CSB investigation report, which is up on the screen at the moment with a link to where you can find it, yes, it does actually talk about the fact that prior to returning the unit to service, they were aware that there was a fault with the level transmitter and it was known to have failed testing, and the unit was put back in service. So there was obviously no priority put on that particular transmitter at the time. You could then also discuss whether it was a fit-for-purpose transmitter as well, because it did only measure the bottom 10 foot of a 30-foot, I think, from memory tower. So we were not measuring the whole height either. So once we got above the 10-foot range in that tower, then obviously there ceased to be an accurate input, and in fact, because of the failure of the level transmitter started to indicate that the level in the tower was falling when it was in fact still rising and well above the 10-foot mark.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, it's been 10 years and my memory is a little weak on answering the question. The best thing I found, though, is to look at that video that CSB created because it goes through each and everything that was wrong. And there was a problem in measuring levels. I think one of the valves was closed.
Yes.
So there are a whole series of mechanical things that were going on. But in addition, there were some behavioral things going on, like the shift supervisor was not there that morning, gone home for some personal problem. And they had a system where the next person in line moved up to be the supervisor. They had a system where when they did a deviation, they'd go back after they had done it sometime later and check off the things they were supposed to do after the fact. I mean, so there were mechanical problems that the CSB video will show you, and then there were a huge series of operational discipline problems that were going on. And again, I think these have been going on for some time, like is always true in these types of incidents, and it only takes one to make the difference.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm sorry I can't really address that, but I think the video will give you the answer.
Yeah, I'd certainly support anyone going out and taking a look at that video. It's a rather long one for the CSB. Typically they're about 10 minutes. This one is about 55 minutes from memory, but it does go through cultural leadership, human factors, design, as well as the operation, as well as the detailed technical direct causes of the incident. So it's certainly well worth refreshing ourselves on. So I think we might actually wrap up that discussion there. Did you have any closing comments, Paul?
I have just a quick one. First, I want to thank everybody for being on the webinar. Just your being here shows your interest in this subject. And let me say to you what I said to the senior process safety expert in DuPont when he retired. It was at his retirement party, and I talked to him, and I said to the group assembled, the fellow's name was Art Burke, I said, Art, you'll never ever know the number of lives you saved over your career. And I'd say the same thing for you as process safety experts or people interested in the subject. You'll never know the lives that you saved by the work that you're doing. So not only do you have a job that pays well, but you have a job with a great moral objective, and that's saving lives. And I wish the best for all of you to achieve a goal of zero for all process safety incidents.
Thanks, Paul. So just a couple of little items. We've got 2 more webinars scheduled for later this year, so encourage you all to register for those and come along to them. One will be on lead process safety metrics, and then towards the end of the year we'll actually have a discussion about the Pike River coal mine explosion. It'll be the 5th anniversary of that tragic incident on the 19th of November. If you have any suggestions or comments about future webinars, please email me, safetycentre@iqme.org, so we can put your thoughts into how we make these webinars a good, valuable tool for you. As I mentioned earlier during the presentation, we've been working on defining some lead process safety metrics and a comprehensive process safety matrix. And these 2 draft guidance documents are currently out for consultation until the 17th of April. They've been developed by a working group made up of representatives from different companies. So if you would like to get a copy of these documents to take a look at and comment on, please email me, safetycentre@iqme.org, and I'll send them out to you so that we can get your feedback into these very, very important documents that will hopefully improve process safety in your organisations going forward. Lastly, we hope that you found this webinar interesting and thought-provoking. This webinar is dedicated to the 15 men and women who were tragically killed on this day 10 years ago. Our thoughts are with their families and friends. As Sir Brian Appleton said, safety is not an intellectual exercise to keep us in work. It is a matter of life and death. It is the sum of our contributions to safety management that determines whether the people we work with live or die. So, we must learn what we can from these incidents and work to prevent them happening again. I'd like to thank Dr Paul Tebo for his time and contribution to this webinar. I'm sure you'll agree with me that his insights on this BP incident, as well as the Baker panel and his time at DuPont, are invaluable, and we've certainly been very fortunate to have him share these with us today. The recording of this webinar will be stored on the IQME Safety Centre website for future use. Thank you, and stay safe.